telemedicina do French Strategic Health Technology Committee e ele que é chefe do gabinete do diretor-geral da abordagem em cuidados da saúde do Ministério da Saúde da França, respectivamente, Dr. Sébastien Woynar e Dr. Maxime Cauterman.
Good. Good. It's good. Well.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning everybody. Thank you for joining this session. Thanks to the organization for having invited us to present our program for developing telemedicine in France. I'll start the presentation with a statement from our previous Ministry of Finance, a statement from 2015. What did it point out at this time? A paradox. Despite a huge and emerging economic market, despite patients, professionals, and health authorities' expectations, the electronic health remained in France a promise. He urged us to accelerate the development. It's not really a surprise if you know the context of France that electronic health wasn't so developed in 2015. We have, regarding the fact that difficulties to access health providers and health professionals is a main driver for the development of electronic health, France could be late at this time. So he urged us to accelerate, and as a response, we have launched in last year a national plan on electronic health. It's not only as a response to the Ministry of Finance, of course. It's also because we are convinced that electronic health can transform our industry, that it can help to solve some emerging problems like access to care in remote areas or care to elderly or to chronic condition patients. We also believe that it can change the global patient experience. So that national plan to develop electronic health embraces a large perimeter from electronic health record to hospital IT, robotic surgery. And we will focus in this presentation on telemedicine, which is a small part of electronic health. And I would like to start with this slide about telemedicine. It could have been a conclusion. It could have been some take-home messages for you, but we thought it was relevant to start with those points. Telemedicine is about medicine, not technology. What we are trying to do is improve care for patients. What we are trying to do is improve access to medical expertise. It's also to improve compliance to guidelines on patients' engagement. It's very important to keep that in mind, that it's not about technology. Sébastien will present you some example after. It's not high technology. Another point is that the development of telemedicine must add value at the system level. It's not a competing medicine. It's something that will improve. It's something that must target the relevant population. It's something that cannot provoke unnecessary cost, and this is something that mustn't create more inequalities. This is very important. Those are some key points that our program relies on. So finally, what is ETAPES? In French, that means experimentation in telemedicine to improve the patient pathway. It's mostly about removing barriers to the development of telemedicine. Those barriers are numerous. It's in the law, technology. It's also the need for an encouraging economic model. Finally, with ETAPES, we only play our role as authorities to set up a relevant environment that allows the proposition of the industry to meet the population needs. With ETAPES, we are targeting 2 million of patients. I'll explain you more deeply what kind of patients. And we are developing 3 different situations of telemedicine: the teleconsultation, the tele-expertise, and telemonitoring. We also invest in a large evaluation of the impact of telemedicine and its externalities. Here are the 3 components of the telemedicine. The first, teleconsultation, is basically doing the same thing that physicians have always done. The teleconsultation is a consultation with the patient at distance. ETAPES in teleconsultation targets the patient with chronic diseases or patients in nursing homes, those patients that have difficulty to travel to the care providers. All physicians except GPs can do teleconsultation. They simply have to set up an agreement between demanding and providing physicians. It's really simple, no administrative paperwork. A simple agreement and a declaration to professional insurance and to the regional authorities. Very, very simple. And we set up a payment scheme that is basically the same that a traditional consultation. It's a fee-for-service financial scheme from 25 to 43 euros for a consultation. We set up a cap, maximum 3 patients a year, maximum 3 teleconsultations for 1 patient in 1 year, maximum 5 for psychiatrists. We also introduce a fee for the demanding parties in case of hospital of nursing home, around 20,000 euros a year. Tele-expertise is also something that was that exists before the ETAPES. It's giving an advice from one physician to another. You don't need the patient to be present when you do tele-expertise. It can be done not in the same time. You can just give information to another physician and then you get the answer. Once again, tele-expertise targets patients with chronic diseases or patients in nursing homes. We're trying to avoid unnecessary transportation. We are trying to avoid elderly people to go to the emergency and accident department and then to be hospitalized. Once again, all physicians except GPs can do some tele-expertise. And once again, you have no paperwork. It's a simple agreement. The payment scheme is different. It's 40 euros by patient and by year. And each physician can only do tele-expertise for 100 patients a year. There are some exceptions in case of special needs. 100 patients a year, 40 euros by patient, it's 4,000 euros for the physician. The third component of telemedicine, probably the more interesting, is the telemonitoring. It's following a patient, a remote patient, and accompanying him with a structured telephone support. The payment scheme is more complex. For the beginning of the program, we target 4 chronic diseases: COPD, diabetes, renal dysfunction, and heart failure. And within those patients, we focus on medium to high-risk patients, those for which we expect the more benefits. Patient consent is needed, as for teleconsultation and tele-expertise. For the physicians, only the relevant specialists are concerned. And the payment scheme offer a share of the fees between the industrial or the technological solutions provider, for the nurse that do the therapeutic education, and for the physician. It's different for each chronic disease. The 3 parts get paid for a 6 months period, and they get an extra bonus based on quality and savings. Sébastien will give you an example of the telemonitoring of cardiac heart failure.
Thank you, Maxime. So I'm Sébastien Woynar. I'm a co-pilot of the Strategic Healthcare Technology Council in France, and so heading the e-health program within Air Liquide Healthcare. So we'll be focusing here on telemonitoring of cardiac failure. Just to go into a couple of details in looking at disease, I think it's quite prevalent here in Brazil because of the Chagas disease, which can has an impact and a consequence on heart failure. But it's also an epidemic in France. There's more than almost 800,000 patients in France that have the disease. And 1/3 of the patients could be prevented from going to the hospital, either through a behavior change. Basically, for the physicians out there, this would mean probably improving the compliance to the treatment for the patient, ensuring that he will take the drugs prescribed by the physician. It could also be having the proper nutritional advice and follow up the guidelines to make sure that he eats properly. So a lot of these hospitalizations can be avoided. Some data here in France, probably very similar to a lot of countries, that 40% only of the patients actually are receiving the proper guidelines therapy. And one of the reasons is not always because the physician is not prescribing right. The major reason, one of the reasons, is because this is a disease, especially for the end states of these chronic heart failure patients. The disease is evolving very fast, okay? So in a couple of months, you probably need to adapt the treatment, increase or reduce some kind of drugs, adapt the food intake or the water intake, and this has to be done on a continuous basis. Now, just imagine a heart failure patient, which is a very severe disease. We're talking about 25% of 25% survival rate at 2 to 3 years on these stages of disease. The idea really is that if ever you're able to adapt, and these patients actually are really seeing their physicians or cardiologists once every 6 months. Well, the interval between the 6 months is probably too far long and too spread out so that the physician can actually adapt the treatments. There's some clinical evidence out there on telemonitoring, and we'll see what it is in a couple of seconds. The last nice study was done by the Cochrane in 2016, and what we see here is actually astonishing figures. We're talking about if ever you're able to monitor your patients and get this information back to your physician, you're looking at increasing survival by 13 to 20% at 1 to 2 years. So this is probably a very, very strong benchmark, and a lot of drugs are not doing this in terms of clinical effectiveness. But you're also reducing hospitals, and I think a lot of countries either are looking at decreasing the hospital rates, or not investing in hospitals because it's costly. So this idea of probably this could support a lot of strategic health programs at the national sector. So these are a couple of figures for the the cardiac heart failure. So what are we talking about really? And it's basically here, and I'm taking the words of Maxime, it's quite simple technology, okay? We're not talking about a revolutionary technology. We're talking about simple stuff, but sometimes simple is better, isn't it? You know, the most simple things are the best. So what we saw, when we say remote patient monitoring, what we're talking about is every day we're going to follow up with the patient and basically monitor a couple of key medical criteria depending on the disease, and that these criteria will give information to the physician to see if he actually is going on he is improving or is he getting worse. For the heart failure, one of the best predictors of decompensation of heart failure, patients getting worse, is the weight. Basically, the heart is stopping to pump and water is getting accumulated before the heart, and that leads to increase of weight through the water that is not processed further on. So the weight is a good way of measuring. So basically, a lot of patients what just have to do is step on the scale, on a weight scale every day, and that would shoot automatically the weight of the patient to the physician. The second thing is usually we like to add some other questions to make this information more specific. Typically, most industries or most companies will add 5 to 8 questions that would predict exacerbation or aggravation of these patients. One of the major symptoms in heart failure is shortness of breath. Okay, so water is getting into the lungs, and the patient is actually not ventilating very well, and he has a shortness of breath. So this information goes in an algorithm, and this algorithm is going to detect if the patient is on course or off course. Okay, so a very simple example, and we'll see this in a couple seconds. If the patient increases by more than 2 kilos in 2 days his weight, that is a good sign that he will be actually in a decompensation state. He will be not getting worse. These algorithms are good, but they don't do totally the job. Okay, just imagine that this happens in real life. The physician gets on the weight scale, and for one reason, this day he's going to get on dressed up, and most of the time he would just be in his pajamas. So automatically he's going to take about 2-3 kilos. That's the weight of your clothes here. And this is going to pop up in the system. So this is where it could be interesting to add some control of the alerts by nurses. And these nurses, in our example, we're going to make sure that the information that's in the system is real. Another very real example is the patient actually stepping on the weight scale with his cat, okay, or his kid having fun, or his grandkid having fun and stepping on the weight scale, and of course this would pop out and trigger some information. That's one part of telemonitoring, as Maxime present. The other part is really helping the patient change his behavior. Okay, so we're talking about patients, again, it's a severe state. Okay, get these figures in mind. We're talking about 25% of people who could die in the next 1 to 2, 3 years. Okay. And a lot of this could be avoided, okay? Am I taking my drugs well, okay? So we all know that the non-compliance of drugs is massive. I think across the board in chronic diseases is about 50%, okay? And this happens all the time. You're running out of your prescriptions, you don't go to see the pharmacist, you don't take it. You add that for heart failure patients, a very, very salty meal. For example, oysters in France are very salty. And this will lead to exacerbation. So you have to help the patient understand this. And of course, the hospital and the physician have a lot of jobs to do this. But of course, what happens is, in the lifespan of a patient, you know, a patient is going to be maybe at least 1% of the time in contact with a healthcare professional and you know, either with a liberal cardiologist at a hospital, but 99% of the time he's all alone. And this is where really we have to help him to be, you know, engaged in his treatment. So a second part of the offer, or what we're doing, is really providing through nurses a structured telephone report. Usually it's once every month where we're going to review educational, you know, nutritional basis, the understanding of the patient on his disease, how he needs to adapt the treatment regarding what the physician said. So these are the two. The components, and all that is feedback to the hospital and the physician. Because again, as Maxime said, we're not talking about technology, we're talking medicine. just modern medicine. This is just being the eyes of the physician at the hospital. And just imagine in Brazil there's so big distances that you could probably follow up in Sao Paulo a patient that would be living somewhere further down the line. So this is a very classic example. It's a real patient. This is the weight of the patient, okay? So it's tracked and then here, there's a little pop in the weight, okay? So this algorithm here is a very simple one. A lot of companies are investing in R&D and big data to have a better predictability of these alerts, but basically the system says, okay, I'm just 2 kilos more, okay? So it pops up an alert, the nurse calls the patient and discovers, and for this patient, basically that the patient actually had a combination of not taking the drug and a meal that was very salty. So this was treated. And because the doctor allowed it, we actually did not, he said, well, in this case specific, what you do is this, and you don't need to go back to me. This case, we sent back some information to the physician, but the physician did not have any kind of intervention to do on himself because he delegated it to the nurses that do the telemonitoring. So I think one of the key components in there is, apart from the operational process and the technology, is this framework Maxime was talking about. So there's a lot of things on the framework. There's a data security, there's medical device regulation, there's operational stuff. A major thing is, how do we fund this, okay? So it was funded through a smart way in which all actors of the value chain, so the physician, the industrial company that does the solution, or the nurse that do the education, has some kind of funding, okay? So I'm sorry it's in French, but basically you see the figures. This is the part for the physician. So he gets 220 euros per year or 110 euros per semester. This is for, this part here is for, it's here, sorry. This column here is for the professional. This column here is for the structured telephone support, okay, or the calling. And this column here is for the industrial per semester, okay? And that's smart because actually it silos whatever he has to do, and it allows also the government to regulate these components. So this is something interesting. And the second thing, so this is where this is a balanced kind of financial scheme. The second point, very interesting, is that there's a value-based system in which if ever all these parties here, all the parties, so I'm talking about the hospital and the nurse and the industrial company, actually hit a target, for example, of reduction of -20% of rehospitalization, then everybody gets a bonus, okay? And this bonus is calculated here, goes up to 50%. So it's a nice and easy way, actually, to make sure that people are trying to improve. And also, something in terms of health policy, it makes sure that we're targeting the right patients, okay? Because the figures I gave you in terms of reduction of rehospitalization or increase of survival, they're, as Maxime said, very specific for a target population. You're not going to improve 20% of survival for all heart failure patients. It's targeted on a very specific patients. If ever you target too large, you're going to reduce your effect, what we call the intensive margin, okay? So there's always this trade-off, you know? So of course we could go very wide, but then you're not going to hit the bonus. So it's a way of focusing the people and all their efforts on the same track. So 4 challenges for the industry. I think the first here challenge is the trust. Trust means that we're talking and we're dealing with health data, okay? So not sure for Brazil, but I heard a couple of stuff, but in Europe and the US, definitely health data, the protection of the citizens in terms of cyber information is something major. So the job here is to make sure that we're talking about health data, they're stored properly. We're also talking about the systems we use. So typically, the medical system, the software, so this software that calculates these algorithms, in Europe in 2018, they'll be regulated as, if the law is applied in all countries, a medical device, okay? So the software will be, 2018, as we read the European legislation, regulated as a medical device. So it's not something you could just, and that means that it has to respect a proper order of development. I'm talking about the software development. One of just made a little parenthesis on this. One of the major things you do is when you do these algorithms, you make sure that you make it in a scientific way and that there's a medical validation of this alert that generates. So this is the trust part, okay? Medical device, data protection, it's the key, okay? And especially with now citizens need to be reassured with all these issues in terms of data protection. The second thing that was interesting with the video just before is the ergonomics, okay? So life as a physician or a hospital, they're packed with patients all the time. So the job for us is really making sure that when you open up the screen, it's very easy, okay? He's got the right information. He's not going to be overloaded with information. So imagine following 100, 200 patients, which could be possible for a physician that is focused on heart failure. He's not going to lose any time, even paid, to sort of screen all the patients. He has to be focused on the patients that need it, and this is what we call the ergonomics. The third challenge for the industry is scientific evidence. We're claiming here reimbursement by the government. It's normal that we, to balance it with the scientific evidence we can bring to the government. So we saw the Cochrane study, but there's a lot of studies ongoing, and so industrials are investing in this sector to make sure that the claim we're making is actually backed up by some kind of scientific evidence. One of the major challenges here is you cannot do traditional clinical trials. So you cannot do a randomized control trial in a lot of cases, okay? You have to do new methods of scientific evaluation. We could talk about this a bit later if you want. But basically, there's one key component, is that if you look at a drug, okay, a drug will not have any kind of variation during the time of the study, okay? Well, when you put in place a telemarketing system, the first patients are in a system where everybody's starting, okay? You can do a runoff period, but basically, you're starting, this is the first time the patient is there, the teams and the physicians are starting. And what happens is that you have sort of an experience curve, and then the last patient that are treated usually are treated with a more experienced team, okay? So there's a way of controlling this, but just to highlight, there's the very specific scientific and medical competence that have been applied here to make sure that we're making for these innovations the right choice in terms of clinical evidence. And the last part is the economics, or the business model. And the idea here, it has to be something that, and I think the financial scheme we present here is illustrating, that our parties are winning. So everybody has some kind of a value and some kind of financial incentive, and that's very important. It has to be balanced between all the actors of the system, and also that you're pulling everybody towards what you want. I think this example of this bonus giving to a very specific target of patients is very smart, and you're not looking to put it to everybody because you're going to lose the bonus and probably reduce the price. So these are the 4 challenges, and from here, I'm going to leave it back to Maxime for the conclusion. And we have time for the questions after, I think.
Thank you, Sébastien. I think with this focus on cardiac heart failure, it makes it clearer, both on operational aspects and on financial schemes. What is important as an health authority and as the health ministry is that we target the relevant population. We have to maximize the benefit. We cannot afford new costs. And we have to create more value in our health system. We do not create extra cost with that telemedicine, and particularly telemonitoring, because we get the money from the savings we do on the hospitalization rates. I think the presentation of Sébastien was really clear on that point. So it's sustainable. We have to create a financial scheme that encourages every stakeholder on the process to give his best. So we share the fees, and we set up some incentives on quality. What is important also is to spread gradually. And Sébastien said it, we cannot take the whole population at the very beginning, because we must provide evidence, and we must show that we really meet the goals. And finally, it's very important to evaluate and adapt. We must be sure that the fees we set are the good fees. We must be sure that the threshold we set regarding the hospitalization rate are relevant. And I must say that even if we are at the very beginning, we have identified some way to improve the model and improve the indicators we follow. For example, in the specific case of telemonitoring of heart failure, we saw that monitoring people give us more signals, and sometimes we send patients more often to the emergency because we follow them very, very close. But once they are in the hospital, their hospital stays are very shorter. So maybe it's not hospitalization rates that matter, but days in hospitalization. This is the kind of evolution we can make after the evaluation. If you want to pursue the conversation and have more information, we'll stay at the delegation of Business France booth until tomorrow. Thank you very much for your attention.